welcome. I see we have a good crowd of people here already, a bunch of attendees, and we have an excellent guest for our conversation today. Before we begin, I'll just introduce myself. For those of you that don't already know me, my name is Eric Dolansky. I'm an associate professor of marketing at Brock University in the Niagara region in Canada. I recently finished my term as president of the North American Case Research Association, and I also currently act as one of the associate editors of the Case Research Journal. It's my honor today to welcome our guest, Armand Gilinsky, to talk about a case he co-authored, Russian River Brewing Company. Armand Gilinsky is the F.J. Korbel and Bros Professor of Wine Business at Sonoma State University. He teaches strategy and entrepreneurship and has done so since 1994. He's also served as director of Sonoma State University's Entrepreneurship Center and director of the Wine Business Institute. He's previously taught at Harvard, CSU East Bay, and Northeastern University, and has authored over 50 published business cases and several articles on entrepreneurship, strategy, and socially responsible entrepreneurship. Like myself, and a few years before me, Armand has also served as president of NACRA, of the North American Case Research Association. He has also been recognized as a NACRA Fellow, which is a recognition of lifelong achievement in case writing, teaching, and service. Armand has also recently completed 6 years as the founding editor of the Wine Business Case Research Journal. I also welcome the other author of this case, Sergio Canavati, an associate professor of entrepreneurship at Sonoma State University. He has experience creating and executing entrepreneurship programs that have reached thousands of students, and his teaching experience includes graduate and undergraduate management, economics, and entrepreneurship and innovation courses at California State University, Los Angeles, and the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He has been published in journals such as the Case Research Journal, the Journal of Family Business Management, the Journal of Small Business Management, and has served in the past as a co-chair and chair of the entrepreneurship track at the North American Case Research Association conference. So welcome, Armand. Welcome, Sergio. Thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Eric. Glad to be here this morning.
Glad to have you here. So we have an audience here. They're interested in case writing. Obviously, they've signed up for this webinar because your case won the Tate Award for Best Case in the Case Research Journal in the year that it was published. And I'm wondering if you can just begin by giving us a little bit about the case. Not everyone in the audience will have read it. So if you can give us a quick rundown of what the case is about, what it accomplishes in the classroom, and tell us a little bit about the process of writing it.
Well, I guess I'll start. The case is about the couple that started a microbrewery in Northern California that became inadvertently famous for a once-a-year release of a special triple hopped ale called Pliny the Younger. The company reports, and the community reports, that the release of this beer, which takes place over 2 weeks, attracts somewhere upwards of 5,000 to 6,000 visitors to the community and generates somewhere between $4 and $5 million of tourism revenue. So it has a major local impact. One of the partners in the case is a former student of mine, and actually she was working in the wine industry when she was my student, but her husband was a brewer. And there's a lot of interesting wrinkles to the case, but the main focus of the case is the decision whether or not to expand beyond a downtown location where people were lining up and blocking the streets to a more remote location, not too far, somewhere around 10 miles north of Santa Rosa, California. In a greenfield area to create a brewery, brew pub, tourism center, visitor center, and so forth. The partners are not necessarily in agreement with whether they should go for rapid expansion, organic growth. And in the meantime, the microbrewery industry is changing quite rapidly. One new microbrewery is being established every single day. So there's somewhere around 300 or 400 new microbreweries. So the entry threat is high. the same time, a number of microbreweries are exiting via acquisition. One local brewery called Lagunitas Brewing Company was purchased by Heineken for a total of $1 billion recently, and a number of other microbreweries have been purchased by large breweries around the world. The partners don't necessarily agree on the direction to go. We decided to make the case a breakfast table conversation when they were reviewing the latest statistics from the release of Pliny the Younger. By the way, tomorrow is the day when they're going to be releasing the 2021 Pliny the Younger online, but you can only purchase it in California. And you can't go to the brewery to purchase it because it's closed. They've decided to remain closed, even though the county is beginning to open up for business.
Sergio, anything to add about the background of writing this case?
Like Armand said, this is a case written by an alumni of the school, and she's a student of Armand, so that made it very meaningful to me. I really appreciate Armand providing the opportunity, connecting me with the story, and connecting me with Natalie. And we did an interview with Natalie for a couple of hours at the brewery, and it really was fascinating to hear from her perspective how she experienced it, and to hear the story of how she was so comfortable at Ken Grossman's pool. Ken Grossman being the founder of the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. So that really told me that the decision to expand, really came down to whether they wanted to go through the pain of expansion, right? But there's also the fact that at the moment it really seemed common sense, just obvious, a no-brainer to expand for many people, although it didn't to us. But now, in retrospect, we can see why there always were some reservations about just expansion, right? I mean, even though it seemed like a no-brainer, now we have a pandemic that really puts a restriction on their ability to generate revenues through their business model, right? So it also showed us the value of experience, the experience that, of course, Vinny had gained in in Blind Pig and failing with Blind Pig, and how that experience marked both founders differently, and I think that's part of the reason why there is a conflict in the case, and that's part of the reason why it's so fascinating. So I really think this case reflects a real phenomenon, and it really, I think with what is happening now, it really brings back the question of growth and the risks of high growth, or just growing because there is more demand for your product than you're supplying at the moment, which really tells us that this brewery really provides something that customers truly value. So thanks, Eric.
Yeah, great. This is great. I want to drill down a little bit on some of what you said. You mentioned that one of the case protagonists, you give a fair amount of information about his background. And I know for myself, when I'm writing a case, and I think this is true of a lot of people writing cases, is deciding which information to include and which information to leave out. So this case has, I would say, a fair amount of background information on the people involved in the case, as well as on the industry. So what went into that decision to figure out, how much of this do we need? I know that writing and editing, I'm often looking for ways to make the case shorter and more efficient, because we know that students' attention spans aren't necessarily as long as they ought to be. So how did you go about this decision of what to include and what not to include, specifically about the background for industry and company?
We aimed to make it a very short case, and that's what we wanted to do. That we wanted our case to be different by being short and accessible, easy to read for, like you said, audiences with shorter attention spans, like me. So that's the one thing that drove us. And if it wasn't like essential or like extremely necessary to people understanding the case, then we removed so much of it, right? So, but I think having that aim really helped because it helped us get rid of most of it. And then we started to add, after we created a bare bones version, we started to add some of the richer details without making it too long. So I think what really guided us was how do we transmit the story? How do we transmit what we just saw? And that's really difficult, I think. But that was one of the things that we were trying to do to make sure that people understood the story, not just facts, not just statistics from industry, but how we thought they experienced it based on our experience, meeting with them, reading about them, even looking at archival news records about what had happened in previous companies. That really helped us understand the whole story, right? And that really was what we wanted to transmit. So and so I really appreciate Armand's push to have it be one really short and concise case. So maybe he can tell you how he was able to bring it down from 35 pages to maybe 8 pages.
Well, there was a complication because I broke my shoulder and dislocated my shoulder during the revisions of the case, so I could only type with one hand. Sergio came along and was really invaluable in helping, but basically I think I fell asleep with my elbow on the delete key, and that's what shortened up the case. No, seriously, folks, the intent of the case was to expose students to strategic growth options in a complex environment, particularly with competitive forces growing really stronger. We wanted students to be able to examine the competitive forces, but in a setting where you had two people who were married to each other who didn't necessarily see eye to eye on the way forward, particularly when they were talking about a $40 to $60 million investment in a new facility just after they had finished paying off their original investors and lenders. So they were a little gun shy. And they have no children, so we didn't know really. There was a lot of stuff that we had to leave out that was, personal details about the company, mainly because they weren't really pleased with it, but also because of the fact that it would have lengthened the case. But the story about the copreneurship was really the leitmotif, if you will, of the case. And I know some people in the chat room have picked up on this. And one of the things that we struggled with was, should we make this a strategy case, an entrepreneurship case, a copreneurship case? There's a lot of things that go into it, but the main reason that the case became short was because of the fact that we decided to excise a lot of information that we felt had really nothing to do with the case. And we got a lot of good feedback from the editor, Gina, and the reviewer team, anonymous reviewer team, about how to do that. So we took that into consideration.
Great. You talked a little bit about, this case could have been a lot of things. And I know that what I write in reviews and what I read in reviews and what I receive in reviews as an author, a lot of times has to do with decision focus and figuring out a clear decision focus that's consistent through the case in the instructor's manual. This case could have been, they've decided to expand and it's a matter of how. It could have been looking more at the financing angle. It could have been earlier in time deciding about how to release a particular brew. How did you two decide that this was not just the right decision to focus on, but also the right time frame? So it's set in April, just after this big event that they have a couple months after, and deciding on that time frame. So if you could walk us through those types of decisions to figure out, this is what we want the case to be about, this is that key decision in the case, as well as this is the point in time that we're going to place it, and this is the time frame we're going to give to make that decision.
This was initially a co-preneurship case, and we familiarized ourselves with that literature a bit to understand how to frame it that way, because it seemed to be the best approach at the time. Because you have a couple who are entrepreneurs and launched they launched a new business or continued an enterprise that was a part of another company, and they grew it very large, and they turned it into a very successful enterprise. So that framework we thought was very appropriate, but I think there were several issues, and I think it's important for audiences to also think about the adoption of their case and to think about what courses it can be used for. And I think one of the things that really stopped us from going in that route is, how many courses can this be used for? Is it really a problem of copreneurship, or is it really because copreneurship has a lot to do with work-life balance and the division between work and the business, because that division tends to become very blurred. But really, the issue here at stake is really a matter of strategies, a matter of whether they want to grow or whether they want to pursue a quality route. And I think, like Armand said, I think it was the feedback from the reviewers and the editor that really put us on the right track and moved us out of this kind of niche positioning for the case into a more a broader positioning that was also more appropriate for the circumstances that we were examining. So I think the lesson for the audience is put it through the peer review process. And really, if you buy into it and you try to follow the advice and also push back on some things that may not make sense for the case because you probably know better than others, it's a really good combination. But the value of peer review is, it's huge, and it's what really helped us give it its positioning. But maybe there's something that I might have forgotten, and Armand can clarify it.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that some of you may or may not remember John Seeger, who passed away last week. He was a former president and CRJ editor, and he was my mentor in case writing. And he always kept admonished. He was in my first case roundtable at NACRA in 1994. He always admonished me that, you try to do too many things with one case, it's going to become useful to nobody. So focus the case and also have a triggering event. And so that's why we decided to set the case in a couple months after the Pliny the Younger release, because of the fact that there was press, and it was pretty impressive, press with respect to the demand for a beer that basically is only released once a year, and that the company also followed, I think, from Natalie's experience, the wine business model of allocation and special releases and special branding, and rather than going the traditional microbrewing route. So it was an interesting overlay in the industry. But the real issue that we faced was, trying to narrow down what exactly was the decision. And I mean, as Sergio mentioned, for some students and professors who teach the case, it sounds like a no-brainer, but there's a lot that goes behind the whole question of growth and expansion. I mean, this is a family business. It's a stable business. Why rock the boat? And there are compelling arguments on both sides for growth versus stability, and those are two parts of a grand strategy. I mean, the other one would be, of course, retrenchment or bankruptcy, which is not really a strategy. But we wanted students to think about more of the long-term consequences of any decisions that the company might make. And that's why we wanted to set it up as a decision of, should we pursue organic growth or should we pursue dramatic growth? And I think that's what John Seeger taught me, is make it really simple for people to see what the decision is, but make them analyze and come up with their own ideas as to why pro and con these decisions might make sense.
Great. Now, had you brought this case to the NACRA conference before submitting it to CRJ?
Yes, we had brought it to the NACRA conference, and we got a lot of really good feedback there. We also brought it to the WAM conference, and we also received very good feedback. And I think the feedback that we got at the conferences was crucial. I think it's crucial to just have to explain what the case is about, right? And it forces us to rationalize to others what it is that we're trying to study, what is the phenomenon at hand, and why the decision is not as obvious as it seems. But it also validates some of your suspicions, in terms of, you may find people that also have expertise in other areas and may be able to say, I think that you're completely right. I think, this is not such an obvious decision. So it provides validation. And then there's also people that may think like there's not really a lot here because the decision is so obvious. So it also provides you with an idea of what the audience may think, right? Even your readers, your students. We also tested this in the classroom. So we tried to get feedback from many audiences. And the case, of course, allows for that because it's an interesting story. It's a darling, in the region. So it definitely helps. And maybe the topic, the industry itself is also of great interest to young audiences.
And I might add that in framing the decision focus, one thing that really helps, and this is some advice I always give to case writers, is start the instructor's manual first. Begin with the learning objectives, 3 or 4 at most, in order of complexity, if you will, or according to Bloom's taxonomy, if you're more familiar with that. But we began with the learning objectives and fashioned the case around those, trying to hit those objectives rather than doing it, the other way around. I know it's easier for most people to think about, I'm going to write the story and then I'm going to figure out how it fits into a canon of other cases, or how it might satisfy objectives. We began with the objectives, and the objectives were to explore these issues of growth and expansion, to explore the issues of competitive dynamics, to explore the issues and identify and analyze the prospects for a particular company and a dynamic industry. So that's kind of where we began, and that helped a lot helped us to figure out what to keep and what to jettison in the final case.
On that note, we have a question from our audience here about this issue of the parallel writing process of the case and the teaching note. And I know some people, as I mentioned in the chat, and Armand, that you just mentioned, start with the teaching note, or at least start with the learning objectives in the teaching note, some framework of the teaching note. I know other people, including myself, I'm very linear. I write the case first with an eye towards what I want it to be, but I tend to write the whole case and then I write the whole teaching note and then go back and iterate it until they fit well together, or at least until I think they do. So how much back and forth, and if you could elaborate a little on this process of learning objectives or core elements of the teaching note, then the case, then go back to it. If you could talk a little bit more about that, I think that's something the viewers would very much like to know more about.
I think it also, like I said, it helps to test it in the classroom, because then you realize that what you're trying to do with the case is not in the case, right? The students start to complain that they can't find what they're looking for. Um, and I think I was at the start I was focused on writing the case, but really I the more I heard Armand say that, the more it made sense to me, and it now I hold it as a best practice in terms of. But like you said, there are many ways to do it. Right? There's no correct way or right or wrong way. But in terms of whether you write the case first or the instructor's manual, I think over time I learned the value of writing the instructor's manual first, and it actually is very pragmatic because it allows us to know what the case could be used for, what we're trying to use the case for, and over time it actually evolved into a method that I think is really practical for me, which is simply looking at the courses I teach or I have taught or courses I know about, and then thinking, how could this case be used in that course? Where would it fit? And what topics can I use it to discuss in the classroom? So once that is figured out, or maybe sometimes we hear a story, right? We hear a situation that is happening, a real life business situation, and then we think, oh, this would be a great fit for this course that I'm teaching, right? And immediately you say, okay, let me write the instructor's manual. If I can write an outline of how I would incorporate it in the class, then definitely I want to pursue this case, right? So that if you start with, one of the 7 habits of successful people is they start with the end in mind. The end is to use it in the classroom. And if you start in that way, it really makes the writing process a lot smoother, and it saves a lot of time, and it really helps tailor the case to that particular story. The only thing is, you may the story you would have written may have been different had you not written it with that course in mind. So there is the craft, and then there is the effectiveness, and I think that's the trade-off. But I think that I definitely would start with because I would try to publish the case, right? It would be easier to publish it if I start with the instructor's manual. So I would definitely go that route, because it's kind of like putting all the ingredients there. So then later you can pull them out for having a successful class discussion.
Right, and don't be afraid to change the learning objectives as conditions warrant. I mean, one of the early learning objectives for this case was to drill students in financial analysis, right? And I thought, oh, this will be a piece of cake. Another one of my former students is the CFO of Russian River Brewing Company, and when Sergio and I visited the company in December, I can't remember which year it was. I think it was 17. Anyway, when we visited the company, we talked to this former student, said, can you give us the financials? And he said, sure. And, sure, but, and then, months later, we still didn't have anything, but he finally gave us just some financial ratios so that we could use. But to give us detailed financials wasn't going to be possible. They weren't going to release those, even in disguised form. So we had to go back and revise that learning objective and say, well, they should have a familiarity with some of the metrics of the industry and how this business stacks up. But we can't really make them do a detailed financial ratio or financial projections based on the information that the company supplied. It's just not possible. So you have to be willing and able to adjust your learning objectives as conditions dictate.
On that note of ratios and money and figures, so one question from a member of the viewing audience is, this is a strategic decision. They're looking at growth. This is going to have a big impact on the entrepreneurs themselves. Without revenue or salary information in specific numbers, how do you overcome the challenge of missing that information and still making a sound, realistic decision about whether they should expand? when the impact on their own financial outcomes is going to be so key to that. So the specific question, I guess, would be, how would you do it in this case? And then I guess the larger scale question would be, this happens a lot. Companies won't sign off on the financials being out there. How do you sort of write around that or deal with the fact that this very important element of the decision is simply something you don't have access to?
Well, I'll just make a short answer to that. We all go through life with incomplete information to make decisions. And even though the Solurzos, Natalie and Vinny, may have, had in their heads what the company was worth and what it could potentially be worth, and I kept pressing them on this issue, and pressing them on the question of, well, where do you see yourselves in 5 years or 10 years? Do you see yourselves still running this business or selling out to a large brewery and retiring in Hawaii? They really did not want to address that question because they saw this business as their child, as their family, and the people in it as their family. They have people who've been working there for 10, 15, 20 years. So that people who've been with them for a long time, and they regard them as family. And they just didn't really want to broach that subject.
Yeah, I would say that really points out the value of multiple sources of data, triangulation. And I think one thing we did was we looked at public records through various databases until we found the actual name of the company. And we found some information they had provided in some previous loan applications in terms of the amounts of revenues that the company had. And once we had the ratios, we were able to extrapolate from that to, generate something that came close to financial projections. So maybe you can get some data from the business, you can get some data from other sources and triangulate. I think that's one way to overcome this. A less rigorous way to overcome the challenge of no financials would be to use there are sources that extrapolate using various federal data sources from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other sources. They're able to actually provide fairly accurate ratios for the enterprises in a specific zip code of a specific size. So like BizMiner or sources like that may be good, but it's less desirable than getting some information from the owner and some information from other filings, other sources that you can find in public records.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier about the review process and about taking it to NACRA and how that shortened the case, focused the case. Is there any other way that you can comment on that you found the review process in particular at CRJ shaped this case, changed something, or on the other side of things that you fought to keep that the reviewers wanted to change? How did the review process not just refine the case, but also refine your thinking about the case?
Well, like I mentioned before, they helped us understand what the true focus of the case should have been, and that really helped us keep the instructor's manual very short and very much to the point. And I think that's one of the reasons the case was successfully adopted and why it's so popular. Because it's easy to use for instructors. It's not a lengthy read in terms of the instructor's manual, and it's very focused on a topic that is very common, very commonly reviewed in MBA courses or strategy capstone courses. So I think I would have not known much of this information had I not gone through the peer review process at the CRJ. The peer review process at the CRJ was very challenging, but it provided really good direction in terms of the focus. It also provided us with direction in terms of even further reducing the length of the case and the instructor's manual. And I think we were able to keep the issue of the entrepreneurship aspect. I think we fought to keep some of those elements, and we fought to also elaborate them in the case itself to make sure that was present, so that the case could really come across to readers the way we experienced it, like I said at the beginning. So I think we definitely pushed back on that, and we were able to reach a medium point in which the strategy became the main positioning of the case, and entrepreneurship became an alternative optional positioning for instructors that wanted it. And I think that's one of the more valuable things that we were able to get from the peer review process.
Yeah, and a good reviewer will be constructive and say, you know, why don't you consider this? There was a lot of pushback on the copreneurship issue, so we had to shorten that. But the copreneurship issue is kind of what made the case relevant beyond our region and beyond the beer industry, because many professors and students around the world are familiar with family businesses and copreneurial businesses. The twist here is that that Natalie, the woman, the wife, is the president and CEO, and she runs the show, which is maybe unusual in other parts of the world. But we wanted also to emphasize the fact that we were talking about a woman-run business. It didn't really matter what industry it is. It could have been cosmetics. It could have been internet, television viewing, or whatever. It could have been anything. But the main thing was that there was disagreement, and the way to show disagreement is really to have dialogue. And so that was one of the things the reviewers suggested. We want more story and less dense industry information. So we punched up the dialogue and turned down the volume on the industry information. I think that the reviewers were really helpful in telling us, well, gee, this doesn't sound real, or this doesn't sound like something that really happened. Yes, you have to take some literary license. I mean, this is, there's an art and a craft of case writing, as the Nomis twins would say, and the art part is the fashioning of a story that will resonate beyond where you live.
I agree 100%. I'm a big advocate of the story element of cases. We've got a few more questions about reviews. So one person is asking the same question in two ways. You get conflicting reviews, or you get reviews that the feedback may not be structured the way you'd want. What does a good review look like? Or if it's easier to answer, what does a bad review look like? And you can interpret bad review however you like. And when you get reviews that tell you different things, whether simultaneously reviewer 1 says to leave this in and reviewer 3 says to take it out, or sequentially where something you were asked to include, you're later asked to remove. As authors, what are you looking for in reviews besides the obvious, it's great, publish it right away?
Okay, well, let me tackle this, and then Sergio, you can refresh my memory. But I think that, first of all, there were CRJ editors in the past who said, don't ever send me another microbrew case. We don't want to see any more of those. No more brewery cases. So that was a hill that we had to climb, because we didn't know, with a new editor, Gina was coming in. I think this was a handoff case to Gina from the previous editor, who was the guest panelist last month, John Lawrence. basically, I called Gina and said, we have conflicting reviews. What's your guidance here? And, sometimes it's okay to reach out to the editor and say, even by phone or now Zoom, whatever, we didn't have Zoom then, um, and say, well, how do we go? Which way do we go with this? Because one reviewer is saying, give us more information. Another reviewer is saying, pare it down. Those are the types of conflicting reviews. A bad reviewer will just say, well, these jokers need to go to a case conference and get some experienced case writer help. And I sort of laugh when I see that because, I kind of am an experienced case writer, but, fair enough. Sometimes a reviewer will take umbrage at what you've written and say, well, I can't use this and it makes no sense to me. So, thumbs down. There's no, unfortunately, there's no emoji on Zoom to put a thumbs down, but you can imagine that sometimes you get a grumpy reviewer, and I've been one myself. I mean, who says, I just don't see the point of this. That's the time when you want to reach out to the editor, either by email or phone, and say, well, can you help me clarify and find a way to satisfy an unhappy reviewer, and at the same time make the happy reviewers even happier.
I'll add, as a current member of the editorial team, absolutely reach out and ask questions. To me, I can't speak for Gina as well, but my experience as both and as an author is when I've sent Gina an email asking for something, she's replied quickly and helpfully. So I agree with what Armand said. Sergio, do you have anything to add?
I don't know. I mean, I would say like reviewers can be unreasonable, that's for sure. But they also represent your audience in a way. So I always look at it like, okay, maybe that may have that question may have crossed my mind at some point, and if that person is bringing it up, I really don't want to undertake all this work, but it seems like it really may need to be done, right? So there is value to a very critical person, like a reviewer. Um, there, there's also value to pushing back and just explaining that the reviewer is incorrect, right? There is value in that too. There's value in defending what. There's always value in defending your stance, right, and why you believe it is that way. It helps you organize your thoughts as well and explain it in a more concise way. So I would say don't be. I think the only time when it would be negative is if the reviewer is really intended in making the case fail, which I don't think has ever been my experience. But I think that there is value to going through a tough peer review process, and I think there is value in trying to comply with what makes sense, and there's value in pushing back and even arguing as to why the reviewer is wrong. So I think rather than seeing it as something unreasonable, I would encourage the audience to see it as an opportunity to look at it from a different perspective. But because that is the audience and that is the people that are going to read the case, so if they have those questions, your audience may have those same questions. If they doubt the validity of what you're saying, your audience may also doubt the validity of what they're saying. That's why the peer review process is very, very, it's invaluable and has stood the test of time.
I would just add to that. I agree with what Sergio is saying, that you can push back. How you push back is important. So they're saying, I can make this change. I disagree with it, and here's why. But if it's important to you, the editor, associate editor, I will do it. There's also instances where I've written, if I make these changes, this case is turning into something completely different. That's not the project that I am interested in working on. But the important thing is first listening and thinking about what the reviewer is communicating and not getting your back up and just being defensive about it. And then really, for want of a better phrase, picking your battles and picking those things that are very important to you or that you really feel are integral to the case and you don't want to change, and not just pushing back on too many things because that communicates something as well.
Right, and plus the company is another audience, so we had
Yeah.
to get clearance before the final submission, even with, because, well, again, this is a former student of mine, and I respect her and her company and her family and her wishes. But the other piece of the puzzle is that, it would be would have been great to make this a multimedia case with video and audio and so forth. But Natalie and Vinny don't really want to do that. That's not their style. There's a lot of press on them. They feel that what's in the press is enough. They don't necessarily want that kind of a visual. We had a lot of photos and visuals in the one of the original drafts, and I just said let's take it out because they don't want it in there. My suggestion is, if you wanted to teach this case as a multimedia case, you start with the presumption it's going to be a multimedia case rather than add it on later.
Interesting, and that gels very well with the comment in the chat in terms of multimedia. And I just want to marry that to an earlier question of online teaching. So multimedia is an emerging way of writing cases or creating cases. Online is something we've all become very familiar with in a relatively short span of time. Less about this specific case and more about case writing in general. Have you found that you are more interested in these other formats or in maximizing the use of, for example, online teaching, or are you finding that you know and enjoy the way that you write cases? Incorporating something like an online teaching plan is fine, but I'm not going to significantly change my formats.
Well, I really think the future should be multimedia cases, but somehow that is easier said than done. I haven't seen a lot of them. I haven't seen a move towards multimedia cases in the numbers that we had expected. Even though education is now online, I have been able to incorporate some discussions of written cases into my courses online, but in an asynchronistic environment, it's definitely more difficult, and I think we would need different technology. Maybe we would need to be able to embed maybe questions in within the case and things like that. So I really think that is the future of education, but I don't know if we are moving in that direction.
If you were to look back at this case and say, I want this to be able to be used more easily online, what would an online teaching plan look like for this case? Would it differ significantly from the existing teaching plan, or would it simply be finding a way to fit that content into different communication tools?
Okay, I think I understand your question better now. Okay, so definitely, I think it would be a different case. It would have been a different case if we would have made the decision from the start that we wanted it to be a multimedia case. I think because the content that you cover with the multimedia material that you can get would probably shape the story. And it probably, I don't know, it may lead to some de-emphasizing of the research, the analysis, and the detail, like we said, in trying, and we would then try to convey the story in a more multimedia fashion, right? In a video, audio fashion, using those senses, because that would be available. So I think the case perhaps would have been different. The way that we would have, the things that we would have paid attention would have been different. The things that we would have emphasized would have been different. So I think it matters making that decision from the start, because it also limits what you can cover and what you want to focus on. So I don't think it would have been the same case.
No, and of course we wanted voices in the case, and so we added the dialogue. But some faces are designed for radio and some faces are designed for TV, as you all well know. I mean, my face is a great radio face, but not a great TV face. So I don't know if I'd want a multimedia case about myself, maybe an audio. But I think it's really clear with Natalie and Vinny in this particular case that they're two very different personalities, and one's a brewmaster, one's a taskmaster, for want of a better word. And there's some things about the two that we don't necessarily want everybody to know about, or they may not be comfortable with, because they're not the easiest people to get along with. I mean, people who get to that point are, you know, who are successful in building a business aren't necessarily going to be the you know, the host of a children's television program, for want of a better word, you know, happy faces all the time. So I think you want to really be careful in selecting, you know, a case to create. You want great characters with great stories and unusual twists. You also want cases about people who look increasingly more like who our students look like, which is a more diverse group. So that's important. But oftentimes the downside of that is getting folks to be willing to show their face on camera. So it's a tough choice. I would be, you know, really in favor of thinking through what you want to accomplish in an online situation before you start a multimedia case, because our students, you know, YouTube video, maybe 2-3 minutes is about the most that they can digest. So you have to you know, chapterize or serialize. I haven't seen any podcast cases. I'm keep waiting for them, but nobody's created them yet. I'm hoping somebody will create one, like The Serial, which was a famous podcast about a real life, you know, legal case. But, you know, that takes a lot of advanced planning. You need to have the technology and the technical skills. I mean, if you record things on Zoom, you know, remotely, or some other way, you know, the audio isn't always good, the video isn't always good, and then going back to try to re-edit or reinsert things, you know, we don't have the budgets to do this. It'd be nice, but we don't have the budget.
I want to ask you about one component of this case, which is the role play. I think it makes it a very interesting and accessible way of looking at teaching this case. Now, I've put in some of my instructor's manuals, you know, in the teaching suggestions section, this could also be done in a role play with this person taking this role and someone else taking this other role, without exploring it the same way you guys did in this instructor's manual. So if you could give us a bit of your thinking in terms of how you developed that and how you determined the amount of information to provide, because there are specific notes for the various people. How big a part of this of the plan was this from the beginning, and the development of that element of the case?
Well, I think that was the entrepreneurship aspect of it that we wanted to pursue from the start. And if I may confess, actually, we had implemented, we were thinking about implementing a similar technique for another case, right? So I think we kind of imported that practice, you know, from another case where there really was a lot of conflict, and we had created this role play. So it seemed to be very appropriate for the context of the Russian River Brewing Company case, because of it being a couple and only having two people. It would be easier to have, you know, clearer roles, and we thought it would also help the students put themselves in the shoes of the founders and see it from their perspective. And we really, what we wanted to do was try to convey, or try to allow the students to try to convey some of the things that we felt, some of the attitudes that we perceived in their conversations, in their discussions in person, and also what we saw online on the YouTube videos, right? There's a lot of content. There are a lot of interviews that you can watch about the people that you're studying, right? About the executives that you're studying, and they can give you a pretty good idea of where they stand on issues like, the expansion of the business. They've probably made comments online and things like that. So we try to capture all of that and put it into a discussion, a dialogue between those two people. And we hoped that in the classroom, the students could actually take one of the sides and then argue their case. And as in many instances, we tried to make a sharper degree of conflict, or make it, they perhaps agreed more than it's described in the dialogue, but focusing on their differences and disagreements was probably the best way to make this available to students and allow them to take the perspective of each of the founders and try to make a business case for or against the expansion.
Right. And there's another voice in the case that's not identified by name, but is a former classmate of Natalie's, who was in my class, who was the executive vice president of a local bank, who was saying, who was reflecting on the amount of money that they would have to borrow and whether or not they were creditworthy. And so we put that in there as well. Although I have to tell you that in reality, I don't think the bank loan was ever a big problem, but we wanted to make sure that students saw that there was another voice in the case.
We're just about out of time. I do want to mention there are 2 more of these webinars on the award-winning cases that are scheduled. The details are in the comments. Michael Goldman and Gina Grandi commented on them there. One last question I saw in the chat, if you guys can just address very quickly, in less than a minute or so. Application of theory in the case, the idea of bringing in theory into the instructor's manual. Did you find that it's better to bring in existing theory, or are you trying to make a new research contribution in the instructor's manual? You're trying to bring in something new. Does it vary from case to case? What are your thoughts on that very quickly?
Well, one of the problems with case journals is citations. The reason that case journals aren't recognized by some of the major bodies like the Australian Business Deans Council and so forth is because of the citation issues. So it's tricky. You got to find a balance between specifying what the contribution of the case is to theory and what you were expecting students to learn about extant theory. So we tried to do a little bit of both. It was salt and pepper here, and we tried to sprinkle a little bit of each spice into the case. My suggestion to authors who are still online and watching is, think through what your contribution is going to be, what this case is going to contribute, how it's different from other cases. You may have to do some research on what other cases have done. And make that explicit in the instructor's manual. Problem is the instructor's manual isn't published, so it never gets cited.
Yeah, I think we try to make to expand theory a little bit by focusing on the entrepreneurship aspect and focusing on some understudied elements of growth in entrepreneurial ventures. But I think in the end we decided to be more pragmatic and reduce the emphasis on that discussion.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Michael Goldman for organizing these webinars and pulling this all together. I'd like to thank Gina Grandi as editor of the Case Research Journal. She answered your questions in the chat as well. And of course, I would like to thank very much our guests, Sergio Canavati and Armand Gilinsky, for taking the time today to talk about their case and about case writing and offer us all this insight and ideas. So thank you very much for joining us.